right. So again, thank you for coming on this rainy morning. This paper I'm about to read builds on the work of panel organizer Michael Joseph, who for years has crafted an impressive body of scholarship engaging the children's poetry of Robert Graves. As Joseph reminds, although Graves wrote poems he hoped to publish for children as early as 1916, it was not until the early 1960s that he gathered them into two slim volumes. The Penny Fiddle, Poems for Children, which you can see here, and Anne at Highwood Hall. This book came out in 1960, and Anne at Highwood Hall came out in 1964. Following Joseph's work, this essay reads the Penny Fiddle alongside the poems of Robert Graves chosen by himself, published 2 years earlier, arguing that the Penny Fiddle takes the darker concerns in much of the poems of Robert Graves and reworks them, summoning in the process a previously invisible child that was only subtly coming into light more broadly in the poetry of the 1960s. Now, sure, T.S. Eliot, Langston Hughes, Carl Sandburg, and even Gertrude Stein published books for children in the first half of the 20th century, but the end of World War II saw an unprecedented interest in childhood and children's poetry in the United States and the UK. The end of the war brought with it plenty of children, and as these children grew, they comprised a huge market for children's texts. As this market grew, so did the middle class's disposable income. Stephanie Kuntz argues in The Way We Never Were that the 1950s marked the beginning of the youth market and the inception of what would become institutionalized as the youth culture. The Penny Fiddle was at the bleeding edge of an increasing number of children's books published by respected poets, and Graves, as a particularly admired poet, played no small part in making visible the child as both a reader and a writer of poetry, in many ways anticipating his American colleagues. Joseph has convincingly argued that Graves' interest in children and childhood was an enduring preoccupation, one that informed his similarly persistent fascination with forms associated with children and childhood, nonsense poetry, folk tales, and fairy tales, forms at the heart of the Penny Fiddle and the poems of Robert Graves chosen by himself. This essay then discusses the construction of the child in the Penny Fiddle as both representations within the poems and as implied readers outside the poems. I argue that Graves fashioned the Penny Fiddle as a kind of poetical primer, exploring the poetic imagination, the acts of reading and meaning-making, and the qualities necessary or less dramatically advantageous to both poets and readers of poetry, however old or young. Furthermore, I situate this reading in the context of Graves' long-standing dedication to the child and childhood, demonstrating that the Penny Fiddle summons a complex and morally ambiguous child, envisions a child who has remained too often invisible to adults. Like the poems of Robert Graves, chosen by himself, the Penny Fiddle is a kind of selected poems. Some of the poems dating back as far as 1916, some from the 20s, and still others contemporaneous with the collection. If, as Graves writes in Poetic Unreason, a well-chosen poetry anthology should be like a medicine chest, while insisting no medicine and no poetry can ever be effective without the consent and cooperation of the patient, then with the Penny Fiddle, Graves has built and stocked a medicine chest accompanied by a canny set of pharmacist-prepared patient notes, a combination that avoids didacticism while advising young readers on the promise and perils of poetry in the poetic enterprise. We'll begin briefly with Randall Jarrell, who, like Graves, was a poet well acquainted with children writing for and about them. In Graves and the White Goddess, collected in Jarrell's third book of criticism, Jarrell famously notes that Graves has never forgotten the child's incommiserable joys, nor has he forgotten the child's and the man's incommiserable, irreducible agonies. He writes naturally and well about bad and worse and worst, the last extremities of existence. Many of the poems Jarrell found so beguiling in the poems of Robert Graves, even while assuring us, as Jarrell puts it, that Graves is a man to whom terrible things have happened, nonetheless partake in the rhetoric of childhood, feature the images of nursery rhyme and fairy tale, childhood games and perspectives, while also turning darkly to meditations on death and impermanence. These poems, especially the ones listed by Jarrell in Graves and the White Goddess, could have appeared in the Penny Fiddle, which contains more than a few poems about death and ghostly apparitions that torment the eyes. The Cool Web, for instance, modulates between dream and nightmare and meditates on poetry, childhood, and the dangerous power thrumming within both. Graves was in his 30s when he composed the Cool Web, yet it fits perfectly in the dark fairy tale atmosphere so prevalent in his 1958 collection, The Poems of Robert Graves. The Cool Web begins by seemingly dividing the adult world and adult perceptions or interpretations of that world from the child's, locating that divide in the ability to speak poetry. He writes, "Children are dumb to say how hot the day is, how hot the scent is of the summer rose, how dreadful the black wastes of evening sky, how dreadful the tall soldiers drumming by." This divide, of course, depends on our interpretation of the next line. But we have speech to chill the angry day, and speech to dull the rose's cruel scent. We spell away the overhanging night. We spell away the soldiers and the fright. Spell, to make words, to tell a story, from the Anglo-Saxon word for narration, is important here. We spell away the fright, the black wastes of evening sky, even the dreadful tall soldiers. But also important is the humbler we. What is its antecedent? Does it refer to adults, perhaps, or maybe poets? Or could it be children, the antecedent actually in the text of the poem? If so, are we literal children, or do we simply seem children when compared to the goddess, the immortal hand or eye that can see these dreadful images anew, and in seeing them, craft them into poetry? The poem ends with an evocation of death or mortality, and with an exhortation to the power of poetry, an exhortation not unlike the one found in Warning to Children, the final poem in the Penny Fiddle, and one that appears alongside the Cool Web in the Poems of Robert Graves. But if we let our tongues lose self-possession, throwing off language in its watery clasp before our death, instead of when death comes, facing the wide glare of the children's day, facing the rose, the dark sky, and the drums, we shall go mad, no doubt, and die that way. Compare that with Warning to Children, which, like the Cool Web, cautions readers, particularly children, about the nature of imagination and the physical world, while also exalting poetry, the imagination's instrument. The poem explores the tension between fantasy and, for the lack of a better phrase, the real world, warning that while imagination enchants and allures, it can also lead one into confusion or even danger, if not balanced with a sense of reality. That is, Graves suggests that the poetic imagination can transport us to new, enchanting places, but it can also craft illusions that might trap or mislead us. He describes how children might be drawn into fantastical worlds, but warns that those who enter may never find their way back, like the damned hero of many fairy tales who, once tasting fairy bread, can never return to the mortal world. Overall, Warning to Children reflects a blend of fascination and caution regarding the power of imagination, encouraging both a love for creativity and an awareness of its potential pitfalls. It speaks to the dual nature of fantasy, both beautiful and perilous. This ambiguity informs much of the Penny Fiddle, a collection preoccupied by the poetic imagination, a preoccupation also found within the Poems of Robert Graves, chosen by himself. In the Penny Fiddle and Poetic Truth, Michael Joseph explicates the arguments for poetic truth found in Graves' The Penny Fiddle. Arguments, Joseph maintains, that are articulated in poems lighthearted and accessible in terms of topic, imagery, meter, and diction, while remaining deeply aesthetically self-conscious. A poetry perfectly tuned to young readers sensitive to poetry at the level of intuition and play. Joseph's argument is complex, on the one hand arguing that Graves' work offers proofs that poetry is not contingent, but transcends all barriers of gender, social class, and of course age, while on the other, maintaining that Graves proffers no universal claims. His truth is not ontologically autonomous, but refined in the experience of poets and dependent upon the receptivity of poets. By poet, Joseph does not mean authors skilled in verse craft but individuals born with a particular cast of mind, those able to grasp and abide by poetic truth. He concludes with the assertion that the Penny Fiddle, in his title poem in particular, legitimates the circumstances of childhood by demonstrating that although suffering may appear purposeless and incomprehensible, it grounds the poetic process, the process of meaning-making. It instructs readers to disregard nothing, not their own clumsiness and frustration, not even an apparently trite, didactic cast-off children's rhyme, because anything may be transvalued by poetic truth, regardless of gender, race, or age. Poetic truth alone determines what has meaning and worth. The children of the cool web recall Allie, which features a first-person child speaker. Michael Joseph has given us an entire essay on the four-stanza, 36-line Allie, the second poem of the Penny Fiddle. Allie and the Lost War, it's called. At first glance, Joseph proposes Allie as a children's poem. It seems unambiguously an ode to lost childhood and a variation on the ancient theme Northrop Frye calls the framework of all literature. How man once lived in a golden age, how that world is lost, and how someday we may be able to get it back again. However, take a closer second look, Joseph recommends, and the poem, first published only 2 years after the close of World War I, transforms into a war poem. Or more precisely, he contends, it becomes a poem that is and is not a war poem, and is not a children's poem. I advise a third look for those of us here in New Orleans, not at the close of World War I, but at the close of this essay, read here alongside the poems of Robert Graves, chosen by himself, read here in the pages of the Penny Fiddle, subtitled Poems for Children, where it immediately follows the Ars Poetica, that is its title poem. Read here, Allie's call becomes another spell, this one inside of a children's poem. Allie, call the birds in, the birds from the sky. Allie calls, Allie sings, Allie calls, Allie sings. Again, we have a poem about poetry. Allie does not make music with the penny fiddle, but draws it from with herself. Allie calls, Allie sings. A young Orpheus, Allie makes poetry, and that poetry makes the world. Allie is much lighter, admittedly, than some of the earlier poems we discussed, like the Cool Web. The speaker, which we later discover to be a child, this is not one dumb to say how too dumb to say how hot the day is, how hot the scent of the summer rose. She calls upon inspiration, calls, if you will, on the white goddess to organize the world, perhaps even to sing it into being, remaking the world by turning it into poetry, into song. Yes, it is Allie who calls, who sings, but only after the exhortation of the poem's speaker. Strangely, however, the poem ends with the child speaker being summoned along with the other animals. For the child, the poet is bound up in the material world, never apart from it, even if inspiration may be. The poetic enterprise, of course, is often conceived as a bid for immortality. You'll recall Shakespeare's Sonnet 55, not marble nor the gilded monuments. But though the rhyme may outlast the gilded monuments of princes, such immortality is fantasy, and a doomed one at that. Allie, call the children from the green. Allie calls, Allie sings. Soon they run in. First there came Tom and Madge, Kate and I, who will not forget how we played by the water's edge till the April sun set. Like Tom and Madge and Kate, the speaker here may believe that he'll not forget how we played by the water's edge, but that metaphorically latent April sun will eventually set, and grammatically, this final tercet stresses that fact. For if the speaker will not forget their poetic play till the April sun set, forget he shall, as shall we all. The penny fiddle reminds us, and as child readers of this fact, reminds us all of the troubled power that comes with poetic play and the poetic truths it can reveal. Thank you, that's all.